Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring a president you might not know much about,
Okay.
Rutherford B. Hayes.
Mm.
And what makes him fascinating is that he oversaw one of the most dramatic economic turnarounds in U.S. history,
Right.
and most people wouldn't even recognize his name.
Yeah.
So to guide our deep dive today, we're going to be using an interview with Professor Mark Zachary Taylor from the American History Hit podcast.
Interesting.
He's an economic historian and the author of Presidential Leadership in Feeble Times, which kind of perfectly describes the era that Hayes inherited.
It really does.
Yeah.
Imagine the U.S. in 1877 reeling from a depression even worse than the 1930s massive labor unrest.
Oh, wow.
The rise of these just colossal new corporations.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a time of just immense change and uncertainty.
Yeah, so let's set the scene.
Okay.
1877, Hayes steps into the Oval Office.
Yeah.
What kind of immediate challenges is he facing? I mean, Professor Taylor even mentioned that Hayes took his oath of office in secret. That's not exactly a sign of a smooth transition.
Not at all. He was sworn in on March 3rd.
Wow.
In the Red Room of the White House,
Okay.
2 days before the official ceremony.
Really?
The election had been so incredibly contentious,
Uh-huh.
and he just wanted to avoid any possibility of violence or an insurrection.
Wow.
So it really highlights the fragility of the nation at that time.
Wow. That's a detail they don't usually put in the history books.
Yeah.
It really underscores the tension of the moment.
Right.
Okay, so on top of this politically charged atmosphere,
Yeah.
what was the state of the economy?
Dire. The Civil War obviously had devastated the country.
Yeah.
But even beyond that, the U.S. was grappling with the consequences of rapid industrialization and globalization.
Right.
Classic boom and bust cycle.
Right.
Tons of money had poured into railroads after the war, which led to overinvestment and ultimately the financial crisis of 1873.
And Professor Taylor even pointed out that this crisis created winners and losers on a massive scale,
They did.
which has obviously fueled a lot of resentment and instability.
Yeah, definitely.
So you've got this volatile mix of economic hardship and political tension. And then, boom, just a few months into his presidency,
Oh, yeah?
the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 explodes.
Huge, unprecedented display of worker frustration.
Wow.
You know, picture this 100,000 workers walking off the job,
Wow.
nearly 7,000 miles of track shut down,
Oh, goodness.
violence erupting in cities across the country.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a level of unrest and disruption that's really hard to even fathom today.
It's interesting that Professor Taylor compares it to January 6th.
Yeah.
Do you think that's an accurate comparison?
Well, both events certainly involve challenges to authority and public order.
Uh-huh.
However, the Great Railroad Strike was far more widespread, and it lasted much longer.
Okay.
It's important to remember that in 1877, there were no social safety nets.
Right.
These workers were facing wage cuts because of the depression and horrendous working conditions.
Right.
So they were desperate.
So they felt like they had nothing left to lose. How did Hayes respond to this, what Professor Taylor called powder keg situation?
With remarkable restraint, actually.
Okay.
He did send in federal troops.
Right.
But their primary role was to maintain order, not to crush the strike itself.
So he wasn't trying to break it up?
Not really, no.
Mm-hmm.
He seemed to understand the workers' grievances,
Uh-huh.
and he wanted to allow them to voice their frustrations without letting things spiral completely out of control.
So he walked this tightrope between trying to restore order
Yeah,
and acknowledging the legitimate concerns of the workers.
exactly.
Did that approach succeed?
Yes, to a great extent.
Okay.
The strike eventually subsided,
Okay.
and while it didn't lead to immediate changes in labor conditions,
Yeah.
it did mark a turning point.
Okay.
Professor Taylor argues that Hayes's measured response actually helped pave the way for the development of the American labor movement.
That's a fascinating take. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily expect a president dealing with such a crisis to end up contributing to a movement for workers' rights. It's a good reminder that history is full of these unexpected twists and turns.
It is.
So we talked about the incredibly tough hand Hayes was dealt when he came into office.
Right.
But here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Despite this chaotic start to his presidency,
Yeah,
Hayes manages to turn things around economically.
he did.
Professor Taylor calls his economic record extraordinary.
I think that's fair.
What was the secret to his success? How did he manage to pull the country out of this tailspin?
Well, his economic strategy was multifaceted.
Okay.
One key element was securing the West.
Okay.
You know, at this time, only about 3% of the population lived west of Nebraska.
Wow.
And there was this vast untapped potential out there. Minerals, timber, tons of land for farming.
So the classic American expansion story,
Right.
heading west for opportunity.
Exactly.
But wasn't this also the era of those massive bonanza farms?
Exactly. And that's where things get a bit complicated.
Okay.
These bonanza farms were essentially industrial-scale agricultural operations, some of them spanning tens of thousands of acres.
Goodness.
They were made possible by policies that encouraged westward expansion.
Uh-huh.
But those same policies often came at the expense of Native American tribes.
Right, because securing the West often meant displacing the indigenous people who already lived there.
Yeah,
Professor Taylor didn't shy away from that difficult aspect of Hayes's legacy, did he?
not at all. He acknowledges the moral complexity of this period.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have this economic boom fueled by westward expansion,
Uh-huh.
but on the other, you have the displacement and dispossession of Native Americans.
Right.
It's a dark side of the story that can't be ignored.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that progress often comes at a cost.
Definitely.
Okay, so westward expansion is one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
What else did Hayes do to get the economy back on track?
Restoring confidence in the U.S. dollar was crucial.
Okay.
The Civil War had led to rampant inflation,
Right.
and investors were hesitant to put their money into a currency that seemed so unstable.
That makes sense. Why invest if you think your money is going to be worth less tomorrow?
Precisely. So Hayes, continuing a policy, actually started under President Grant,
Okay.
committed to returning the U.S. dollar to the gold standard.
Okay.
Essentially, this meant guaranteeing that paper money could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold.
So it was about creating stability and predictability in the financial system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This move reassured investors that the U.S. was a safe and reliable place to do business.
Okay.
And then there's the issue of corruption,
Right.
which was absolutely rampant at the time.
Yeah.
The Grant administration had been plagued by scandals,
Yeah.
and Hayes was determined to clean things up.
Didn't Professor Taylor mention the New York City Custom House as a prime example?
Yes, at the time, the New York Custom House handled about 70% of the nation's customs revenue,
Wow.
and it was notorious for patronage and bribery.
Wow. So a hotbed of corruption. What did Hayes do about it?
He took it head on. He launched investigations, fired corrupt officials, and implemented reforms to make the system more transparent and accountable.
Okay.
It was a bold move,
Mhm.
and it sent a clear message that corruption wouldn't be tolerated under his watch.
It sounds like he was willing to ruffle some feathers to get things done.
He definitely wasn't afraid to take on the establishment, and this focus on good governance really helped to restore public trust,
Mm-hmm.
which in turn contributed to economic stability.
So we've got westward expansion stabilizing the dollar, tackling corruption.
Yep.
It's starting to sound like Hayes was a much more effective president than most people give him credit for.
Absolutely.
Okay.
He was operating under incredibly difficult circumstances,
Right.
but he managed to implement policies that had a lasting impact on the country. And it's all happening during the rise of some of the most iconic figures in American industry:
Oh, yeah.
Andrew Carnegie,
Right.
John D. Rockefeller,
Yeah.
Philip Armour.
It's amazing to think that Hayes's presidency coincided with the emergence of these titans of industry.
It wasn't a coincidence. The economic crisis of the 1870s actually helped these figures consolidate their power.
Oh, how so?
They were able to buy up failing businesses at bargain prices,
Oh, wow.
build monopolies, and ultimately reshape the American economy.
It's like the crisis created the conditions for these industrialists to thrive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They saw opportunities where others saw only disaster,
Yeah.
and their actions had a profound impact on the country, both positive and negative.
Okay, so we've covered the challenges Hayes faced,
Uh-huh.
his economic strategy, the rise of big business.
Right.
But here's a curveball.
Okay.
He only served one term.
Right. And that's a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, why would a president who seemingly had so much success walk away after just 4 years?
Especially after navigating such a tumultuous period.
Yeah.
It's perplexing. But Professor Taylor offers some insights.
Okay.
He points out that this was the Gilded Age,
Uh-huh.
a time when there was deep suspicion of executive power.
Right.
Many people feared a strong presidency, seeing it as a potential pathway back to tyranny.
So it's almost like a self-imposed check on presidential ambition.
Precisely. Plus, Hayes himself was a strong advocate for limiting executive power.
Huh.
He even proposed a single 6-year term for presidents.
Wow. And he lived by his convictions. Professor Taylor even quoted Hayes as saying he looked forward to the end of his presidency the way a schoolboy anticipates summer vacation.
Yeah, it's an amusing anecdote that reveals a lot about his character.
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder, what would a second Hayes term have looked like?
Yeah.
Would he have continued to shape the trajectory of the American economy?
It's fascinating to think about what might have been.
Yeah,
But even with just one term, it seems like Hayes had a profound, albeit often overlooked, impact on the country.
absolutely. Professor Taylor makes a very compelling case for that.
Yeah.
Hayes's presidency marked a pivotal transition to the modern industrial economy.
Uh-huh.
His leadership, while understated, was absolutely crucial in navigating a period of immense change and upheaval.
So what does all this mean for us, the non-historians, trying to make sense of it all? Why should we care about Rutherford B. Hayes?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
I think there are several key takeaways here. First, sometimes the most consequential figures are the ones we know the least about.
Okay.
Hayes's story is a powerful reminder that history is full of surprises.
It also shows how interconnected everything is. You can't really understand the economic landscape of today without understanding these pivotal moments in the past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The decisions made during Hayes's presidency have had a ripple effect that we are still feeling today. And it prompts us to ask, knowing what we know now about the long-term effects of industrialization and globalization, how do we view Hayes's legacy?
Right. Was he a visionary leader who paved the way for American prosperity?
Uh,
Or did he set in motion forces that ultimately led to greater inequality and social unrest?
there's no easy answer.
Right.
But that's what makes history so compelling.
Yeah.
It challenges us to wrestle with these complex questions and grapple with the nuances of the past.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really does make you think. What strikes me is how some of the themes from Hayes's era,
Mm-hmm.
globalization, corporate power, economic inequality,
Yeah.
feel incredibly relevant to what we're experiencing today.
Definitely.
It's almost as if we're living through a remixed version of the Gilded Age,
Right.
just with different technology.
It's a fascinating parallel, isn't it?
Yeah.
The challenges might manifest differently, but those underlying tensions and dynamics persist.
Yeah. And Hayes, despite his relatively low-key style, really seems to have risen to the occasion.
Yeah.
You know, he understood that delicate balance between progress and stability,
Right.
between addressing the concerns of workers and fostering a climate that was favorable to businesses.
Uh-huh.
I mean, he was a master of nuance,
Right.
which isn't something we often associate with politicians.
Right. Nuance is often seen as a weakness or waffling, but in Hayes's time, it was essential.
Yeah.
One wrong move could have easily tipped the scales toward chaos. He managed to navigate an incredibly complex landscape and lay the groundwork for incredible economic growth.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder why he isn't more celebrated in the history books.
I know. You'd think a president who steered the nation through such a tumultuous period and set the stage for such prosperity would be a household name.
Perhaps it's because he didn't fit the mold of the great man of history.
Yeah.
He wasn't flamboyant or a self-promoter. He didn't crave the spotlight. He saw himself as a steward, someone guiding the nation through a difficult period,
Uh-huh.
and then stepping aside when his job was done.
It's an interesting contrast to the cult of personality we often see in politics today, isn't it?
It really is. And I think it speaks to the humility of many of the
Oh.
Gilded Age presidents. They weren't obsessed with their image or legacy. They were focused on governing.
Yeah, it's actually quite refreshing in a way.
Yeah.
A reminder that leadership isn't always about grand gestures or fiery rhetoric.
Right.
It can also be about quiet competence and a deep commitment to serving the nation.
Well said. And I think that's a valuable lesson for leaders today.
Yeah.
It's not always about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about making thoughtful decisions that will create a better future.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Rutherford B. Hayes and his unexpected impact on the American economy,
Okay.
I have one final question for you
Okay.
and for our listeners.
Right.
How do you think we'd be talking about Hayes today if he had sought and won a second term?
Huh.
Would he be a household name? A presidential icon?
It's impossible to know for sure, of course.
Right.
But it's an intriguing question. Given the trajectory of his first term, it's certainly possible that he would have cemented his place as one of the most consequential presidents in American history. Maybe even one of the greats.
That's quite a thought. Well, I think we've given our listeners plenty to ponder today.
I hope so.
If you're interested in exploring this pivotal period in American history further, I highly recommend checking out Professor Mark Zachary Taylor's book, Presidential Leadership in Feeble Times.
That's a great read.
It's a fascinating look at the often overlooked presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes and his lasting impact on the nation.
Yeah.
And until next time, keep diving deep.
Yeah.